Hello, Michael. Welcome. I've been my first guest on History in 10.
It's a real pleasure to be back.
We're going to get straight on with it because we've only got 10 minutes to chat. And when the time runs out, the time runs out. Recently, and coming up on my blog very shortly, is a blog you wrote about the libraries and the books that were held within the monasteries, both pre and post dissolution. So I wanted to do a deep dive into that subject in the 10 minutes we had available. So can I get straight on and ask you the first question?
Go for it.
Okie dokie. Tell me about why books were important to monasteries, and how did they gather their books, and how did the monks use them?
Wow. Lot there. Well, the reason I became a monastic historian is because of medieval illuminated manuscripts and the seed sown by that great Umberto Eco novel, The Name of the Rose, set in that monastic scriptorium. And actually, the reality of monastic libraries was a little bit different. Books were absolutely essential for monks. A portion of every single day was set aside for what's called divine reading, lectio divina, the reading books in the cloister. And these are edifying works of scripture or the monastic rule. And there were also needed books to sing the liturgy that punctuated the day. And also monasteries developed huge collections of books on law and medicine as well. So they are absolutely integral to the day. Now, we have it in our mind, the monkish scribe laboriously copying out beautifully illuminated manuscripts by hand. And there is something to that. Monks were great producers of books, and some of the greatest treasures of medieval bookcraft. Great works of art in their own right were produced at monasteries. Think about the Lindisfarne Gospels, for instance. That is a product of the names, the clues in the name, isn't it?
It is
And
really.
and book production at monasteries continued until the very, very end of the Middle Ages. Now, most of the books, however, aren't quite on that scale of illumination and beauty. They are functional books. They might have the odd decorated initial, minimal decoration as well, picked out in red, but you also get the beautifully produced ones as well. They also bought books. There was a thriving commercial trade in books, and there were lay scribes, and this is especially in the later Middle Ages. They got books by gift and by exchange. And it wasn't just the monasteries themselves who built up libraries. Individual monks in the late Middle Ages, from the mid to late 13th century onwards, were building up their own little collections of books. Now, in theory, this is forbidden by the rule of St. Benedict, which prohibits all personal property. But it's something which is viewed indulgently. It's part of their personal spiritual armamentarium, to have these collections of books. And so you often find them with little ownership inscriptions of books. One of my favorite is a treatise on optics and music, which was owned by a monk of Byland Abbey in Yorkshire, and he somehow managed to buy it from a carpenter in a nearby village. What was the carpenter doing with it? And also, don't forget that the Middle Ages takes in the age of print, the invention of movable type in the 15th century. Monasteries were big early adopters of printed books. I know they're often associated with the other side of the great 16th century religious divide with Protestantism. Peace, Print and Protestantism was a book I can remember reading in my A-level days. But no, monasteries were big early adopters of printed books. And there were even printing presses set up within the confines of some of them. For instance, Caxton's press at Westminster, a press at St Albans, and huge numbers of printed books survive from monasteries across Europe.
So we have these huge numbers of books contained in these monastic libraries, a huge source of wealth and information and knowledge in a time when books were really rare. The only other person who collected a lot of books, of course, was, the king, really. They were so precious. But the dissolution came along, and what happened to those books?
Well, but there's something about it's quite a complicated story, actually, that there is quite an interesting rate of survival for books, and the salvation of books and the dispersal of the libraries kind of is a little bit more complicated than other aspects of monastic material culture or art, if you want. First of all, some of them go to the king's library. The king wants some of them. And as early as, the early 1530s, late 1520s perhaps, books from monastic libraries have been gathered by Henry to shore up his quest for a divorce. They are great repositories of learning, manuscripts going back to the Anglo-Saxon age. Monastic libraries are described in the 15th century as being a treasure house for monks, but also there are these books buried away in these libraries that the king wants, was he might find some theological or historical justification for his quest for a divorce. So he's already got feelers out, and a guy called John Leland, who is Henry's librarian and antiquarian, tours the monasteries looking at the contents of the libraries and sort of kind of earmarking probably books which are going to go into Henry's library. There's also, we know that books have been saved at the Dissolution by monks themselves. They either might slip the odd book into their saddlebag as they leave the monastery, or we know of concerted attempts by monks to save the libraries virtually intact. Brother John Heptonstall, one of the last monks of Kirkstall Abbey, he pops his clogs in the reign of Catholic Queen Mary, and he mentions books in his will, books in the chest at the bottom of his bed, which is basically most of the library of his monastery, and it's to be restored to Kirkstall should it ever come up again. Similarly, monks of Monk Breton buy back huge numbers of books that had been in the monastic library at the time of the suppression. Then there may well have been the case that the last prior of Byland also tries to save a substantial portion of his library intact. Now, we also know of, like, a little bit later on, that Protestant divines, some Protestant bishops, are largely responsible for saving huge numbers of monastic books as well. The information contained within them, there might be some treasure within them, some theological treasure, that the writings of these church fathers is important to them. And also there is also something that these are beautiful historical artifacts that need preserving as well. But going back to the Lindisfarne Gospels, that probably survived, not because of its illuminations, however, but because of an interlinear translation of the text in English, early English, which may have appealed to antiquarians in their quest to save things as well. So it's quite a interesting pattern of survival, quite uneven as well, varies between houses. We're going to talk about rates of survival earlier, but it goes from being like hundreds of books survive from Durham, whereas there is many monasteries we do not know of a single book that survives. Now, some books were purposefully either destroyed or just fell apart through neglect at this time because they were no longer needed. I talk about it in the blog that will be going up about Roach Abbey and about service books being used to mend carts, and it's because that's probably not because the contents of them were offensive, but that way of life had seemingly ended. The monks were no longer going to be singing service, and we know of contents of monastic libraries being used to, by fishmongers and the such like, to wrap people's purchases of herrings in and things like that. And well, it's not you do that, but that is something that had been going on throughout the Middle Ages. Some of the most remarkable survivals of early monastic scripts survive from binding waste, and these are medieval bindings that even in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, there were old books in manuscripts that were no longer being read, and they'd been replaced by either a new manuscript copy or a brand new spanking printed book, which the monks found easy to read and might even have an commentary around it as well. Oh, this 9th century copy of Boethius or something. Who needs that now? So let's chop it up and use it for book bindings.
I guess we do that. And I know we're running out of time. So
oh gosh, yeah.
How many books are left, and where could we see a great example of a monastic book in the last 30 seconds, Michael?
About 5,000 survived. The British Library's got loads. So's the John Rylands. Most major scholarly libraries around around Britain have them. Oxford and Cambridge and London in this country is where they're concentrated.
Perfect. And so just to say to everybody, I'm going to put a link in the description below this video to the blog that Michael wrote about the monastic properties. And we also have a podcast that Michael did at Revo Abbey with me, and that will also be in the link below. And I think that's our time up, Michael.
Flew by.